Hello, fellow sentient, self-reflexive manifestation of energy in an unmoral and meaningless universe who goes by the name of To Be Serious. Are you a fan of Monty Python? I quite like Monty Python. I'm just going to play a clip from Monty Python, and in this scene, John Cleese, the customer, goes into a pet shop with a dead parrot, and he's trying to convince the shop assistant that the parrot is dead. Let's have a listen together, shall we?
This parrot is no more. It has ceased to be. It's expired and gone to meet its maker. This is a late parrot. It's a stiff, bereft of life. It rests in peace. If you hadn't nailed it to the perch, you would be pushing out the daisies. It's run down the curve and joined the choir invisible. This is an ex-parrot. Well, I better replace it then. If you want to get anything done in this country, you've got to complain to go blue in the mouth.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed that clip. Now, that scene is amusing because the customer is stating the obvious, and for minutes and minutes and minutes the shop assistant is just rejecting what he's saying, even though it's a self-evident truth that the parrot is dead. And this is a lot how I feel about the situation I'm in when I find myself on a planet with the majority of the citizens on the surface of this planet actually think that you can deprive a non-existent being of happiness. I mean, it's just absolutely ridiculous, and people seem to think that if you don't bring somebody into existence, you're depriving them of happiness. It's just not right, and they refuse to accept that there is value in not bringing somebody into existence if, by bringing that person into existence, you're exposing them to harm. But this is fallacious. This is illogical reasoning. I mean, if you see my Zargog Needs Your Help video, you've got a scenario where you can choose to bring 7 billion happily ecstatic people into existence, but it comes at the cost of bringing one little boy who will be thrown into the hands of Freddy Krueger for 20 minutes. And people uniformly choose not to let that planet be inhabited, because they can see logically that the only moral obligation we have is to not allow suffering to take place on this planet. But there's no moral obligation to create as many people as we want to so that they can experience happiness. It's all for ourselves. It's all a selfish reason when we're creating new life. Now in your video it said on the screen, it said, I am an antinatalist. If you're not an antinatalist too, then you're an asshole. Now I think this is an unfair caricature of the antinatalist position. Certainly some people reject antinatalism because they are in fact callous individuals. So for those types of people, I think asshole is quite descriptive of them. But I think for the majority of the human race, they seem to have an inability to appreciate simple inductive logical reasoning and apply that to the human condition. And for those people, they're just irrational. They have false beliefs that is creating unnecessary suffering for their children. And it's quite ironic really in a way, because your own children are the people you love and care about the most, but by bringing them into existence you're actually hurting them. So it's incredibly ironic, and it is sad. It's a tragedy. It's a tragedy of global proportions. Now, you said in your video that the antinatalists need to need to think about why people think that antinatalism is flawed as a philosophy, as an ideology. Well, I can tell you that over the last 6 months I've been quite busy exploring these issues and exploring the reasons people give for them rejecting antinatalism, obviously in a very aggressive way. And I'm going to relate the first few points to my Zargog Needs Your Help video. I'd recommend that you see that. I mean, many people who have watched that video, they just watch the video and they just deem it automatically irrelevant to the debate of procreation, of the morality of procreation, without even providing a hint of a detailed deconstruction of the thought experiment. You know, and why is this? It's because there is no plausible deconstruction of that thought experiment that isn't extremely incriminating to people who decide to have children. They make erroneous claims that there's a false dichotomy in that thought experiment, you know, but it's not a false dichotomy. You either bring that happy person into existence, you either bring those 7 billion people, happy people, into existence, and that one suffering little boy, or you don't. You know, I mean, so there are 2 clear options. They're mutually exhaustive, they don't overlap, and they're mutually exclusive. You know, it's either one way or the other. You know, and there are 2 clear-cut options, and people will say that there's a false dichotomy. It's like when you're talking about the human condition, it's like their ability to apply logic is just completely hijacked by their irrational need to defend procreation, so much so that it bastardizes their ability to apply simple logical induction, you know, to the human condition. And another interesting case is when they actually project their hatred onto Zargog. They displace their anger onto Zargog, when the real object of hatred is themselves. I'll give you an example here. I won't name the person who made this quote, but he says, I would not take that deal, so he wouldn't bring 7 billion happy people into existence because he knows that in that thought experiment one little boy would suffer. He says, fuck super powerful malevolent beings, the problem with the world is not such beings. Hold it right there. Fuck super powerful malevolent beings, the problem with the world is not such beings. I mean, that's like saying, it's ridiculous. It's like saying, let me see, it's like, fuck him, right? The problem isn't with him, but fuck him anyway. I mean, it's just Mickey Mouse logic. So the problem with the world is not such beings, but people that would take that deal. Now, what he means is super powerful malevolent beings. The problem with the world is not such beings, but fuck the people that would take that deal. You know, his anger is directed at himself, but that's unacceptable to his conscious mind. So he's displacing the anger he feels towards himself to the super powerful malevolent being who I portrayed in that video. I mean, this human psyche is just teeming with this kind of irrationality and insanity, you know, with people who are defending procreation. Many people, they kind of like project their fear of death, i.e. non-existence, onto me. Like, for example, one person said, it's not my fault you're shit scared of death. Now, I'm not shit scared of death. I mean, I have got an irrational fear of death, and the idea of my own non-existence causes me just a little bit of nausea. It's a little bit disconcerting to ruminate on a little bit, but I know that this is irrational because there's nothing to fear, if you're free from pain and suffering and you're not deprived of pleasant mental experiences, then there's absolutely nothing to be frightened or perturbed about, absolutely nothing at all. But it's them, you see, they're scared of non-existence. The idea of there not being any humans in 100, 150 years' time, that really frightens them. So they're displacing, they're projecting their fear onto me, when I'm just saying, there's actually nothing wrong with being non-existent. There's nothing wrong with not having come into existence at all. And the people who have died, the people like Shakespeare, like Isaac Newton, like Albert Einstein, they're all dead. Now, to be honest, they're not being deprived of anything right now. They're not being deprived of happiness, and they're free from pain and suffering. But it's like it's an irrational inability to see non-existence or sentience for what it really is. People make false claims about what I'm trying to achieve in my videos. They say things like, who made the choice yours to decide whether or not someone starts a family? Who do you antinatalists think you are? And I'm not trying to choose to decide whether or not someone starts a family. No, I'm just expressing my views and giving logical arguments, as to why, ethically, it's not in the interest of the children you're bringing into existence to bring them into existence. It's increasing the net sum of suffering in the world. Claims that 6.6 claims that since people tend to be irrational animals, then all people are irrational animals. Well, to be honest with you, most people are irrational with assessing the human condition, because they think that somehow, if you have a fantastic happy life, then that confers an advantage over non-existence or sentience. But it doesn't. I mean, you'd have to say that somebody who hasn't come into existence is being deprived, and you can't do that. It's illogical. But some people can do this, just because human beings have a tendency to be irrational when they're unable to apply inductive logical reasoning to the human condition. That doesn't mean that every single human being is unable to apply logical inductive reasoning to the human condition. Many bold assertions without any argumentation whatsoever. Just extinction is a bad thing, and just walk away. You've got to actually argue why extinction is a bad thing. Because I'm looking at Mars and Jupiter and Saturn, and I'm seeing nothing wrong with the state of affairs on those planets. Using the existence of other animals on this planet to justify mankind's continued existence. Well, we could have a discussion about that. We can talk about that. It's a valid issue to bring up when discussing antinatalism. 8. Highlighting the practical and moral difficulties that we face due to the conflicting moral obligations we have to stop human procreation on the one hand, whilst catering to the interests and needs of those who currently exist on the other. Now again, I'm going to sit here, and I'm perfectly happy to have a reasoned, polite, civilized conversation with somebody who wants to explore discussing those issues. Some people, they use the fact that some people are utterly selfish as an excuse for procreation. I mean, one miscreant, he said this: the only way someone can have value is if they provide some use for me. Now, that kind of person definitely would fall into the category of an asshole. 10. Failing to acknowledge that the root cause of the problem of all human pain and suffering that has ever occurred on this planet is procreation, and not, for example, blindly following authority figures. The root cause of suffering is procreation. I mean, there's no escaping from that. Using biological determinism as an excuse to justify their immoral behaviour. Somebody says, if humans wouldn't want to exist, then they would die out pretty fast, wouldn't they? True. We have a natural instinct, a desire to survive, even under bad conditions. Okay. We have a natural instinct to survive because we have a very strong fear and aversion to the idea of us dying as individual, sentient, self-reflexive organisms. But when we're talking about procreation, we're not talking about our own survival, we're talking about some kind of ephemeral notion of survival of the species. And just because something is a natural desire, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily acceptable and should just get a green light, you know. Projection of the true nature of procreation onto the act of merely expressing and supporting antinatalist arguments. For example, using words such as dangerous. Well, procreation isn't just dangerous, it's fatal. It's a guaranteed death sentence. When you give someone a birth certificate, you might as well write out their death certificate and just write time, ? How, ? When, ? Selfish. Well, of course, procreation is selfish because it can never be in the interest of the person you're bringing into existence. I can see selfishness in people's justifications for wanting to have children. Literally, some of them, they say, like, I want to give a child a meaningful life, I want the human race to exist, I want. It's selfish. Overbearing. Well, you're asserting your authority and your power and your ability to bring new life into the world, and you're imposing it on somebody who has no say in the matter. So that's a form of overbearing. It is overbearing. Arbitrary. Freely chosen. Procreation is freely chosen. I mean, I don't believe in free will, but in a moral sense, it's freely chosen and should be treated as if it's a freely chosen choice. And insidious. Insidious is like stealthily harmful, something like that. Yes. Insidious. Yes, the nature of pain and suffering on this life is insidious because it doesn't all happen at once, spontaneously. It's just pain and suffering. I mean, I guess people die quite frequently, don't they? One every 1.78 seconds? Death. So that's not really insidious. To me, that's kind of like, very repetitive, quick, noticeable statistic that someone dies every less than 2 seconds. Being encouraged by others who disagree with me to commit suicide. If you think life is terrible because everyone or even just one person suffers, then let's see what happens when you kill yourself. A true antinatalist should gratify his need to end life by ending his first. Be a role model. Yeah, but unfortunately, if I commit suicide, then there are people who rely on me, At the moment, my mother's relying on me heavily, so I'm not going to kill myself knowing that if I do that, I'll cause an enormous amount of suffering to my mother. And also, as I've discussed earlier, suicide is something that's very, very difficult to do. I mean, it's extremely stressful to put yourself through that position. But I don't think you can equate the ease with which, the relative ease with which you can decide not to have a child with committing suicide. I mean, committing suicide is a big sacrifice in a way because you've got to overcome a vociferous, deep, inbuilt, ingrained instinct to not kill yourself, basically. But if you decide not to have children, it's like, okay, who am I doing this for? I'm doing it for the child, for myself. If I have a child, I don't want to impose pain, harm, and suffering and death on another human being, just because it will make, it will gratify some of my current needs. So I'm going to do the right thing, and I'm just going to decide not to have the child. I mean, even if you really passionately want children, I think that's a relatively easy thing to do compared to putting a gun to your head and pulling the trigger. Caricaturing the notion of non-existence. Someone said, fuck life, screw consciousness, I'd rather be an autistic, deaf-mute guppy fish swimming in Great Fago. So here we have a completely, like, doolally interpretation of what non-existence means. So you decide not to have a child. So is your child, your non-existent child, going to be mute, or a deaf-mute, or autistic? Then they're not going to be any of those things. They're just not going to exist. It's like there's this tendency for human beings to see non-existence in some kind of deprived manner, when the issue of deprivation is not a question that comes up, because you cannot deprive somebody if you don't bring them into existence. Misrepresenting my position, for example, you long for an apocalypse. I don't long for an apocalypse. You know, it's not a very cheerful, uplifting thing for me to recognise that the human condition is irrevocably flawed and pernicious. But you know, we have to behave in accordance with logic if we want to act in the wisest, most compassionate manner that reduces pain and suffering in the world. So unfortunately, I think the best thing to do would be to gradually phase out the human race. And if people disagree with me, then it's either because they're an asshole, or it's because they're irrational, and they can't look at this thing using logic, and they just engage all their emotions, and they attribute words like deaf, mute, autistic, guppy fish to non-existence. You know, so they're not thinking clearly. You know, it's like there's really something fundamentally wrong with the way people regard the human condition. They're not doing it in an objective way. First of all, you should have your objective way of looking at things, and then after that, you should allow your emotions to filter through the logic, and then that should inform your emotional responses. But they're doing it the other way round, and they're looking like such fools. Ad hominem attacks, the great X attack. You're lazy, you're stupid, you don't want to solve any problems, real problems. You know, I'm the one who doesn't want to create the problems in the first place. Think about that. And I'm certainly not stupid, as I think would be pretty obvious from, you know, if people have actually watched some of my videos and read the comments that I've put down, that I've made. Many people, they equate nature on a par with reason and logic. For example, suffering is just an undesirable feeling, and humans have a natural instinct to avoid suffering. Yeah, so it's natural. I think I've made that point already, actually. Yeah, so something is natural, so that's acceptable, that's good, that's the wisest thing to do, that's the best thing to do, that's a good thing to do, so we shouldn't feel guilty about bringing new life into the world, or actually reflect on the ramifications and implications of bringing new sentient life into the world. Appeals to infinite suffering in the universe, for example. Plus, chances are we live in an infinite reality which likely could contain an infinite amount of sentient consciousness. So this person is so resistant to the idea that the ethically right thing to do is to phase out the human race, that his mind will actually conjure up notions of infinity, which would imply infinite suffering, and he would prefer to see the universe as being composed of infinite suffering, you know, because he finds that more palatable than thinking that you know, we have a moral obligation not to have any children. It's like an infinite expansion of the consciousness of consciousness. This just reveals the insatiable need people have for their consciousness and the sentience to branch out and expand. It's horrible. It's demented. It's pointless. It's meaningless, and it's pernicious. I really don't like to reflect on what mankind might achieve in the next few 100 years. Okay, so you've got the majority of the human race scurrying around with this insane belief that non-existent people want to come into existence, right? And then you've got exponentially increasing technology. You've got a penchant for animals to want to reproduce more animals. I mean, can you actually begin to think through some of the scenarios that all this could lead to? I mean, do I need to spell this out? I mean, I will make a video discussing this issue in depth, but let me just leave it at that for now, for people to reflect on. And there's a big issue with people conflating the notion of starting life with continuing life. For example, here we go. Somebody said that evil exists in the world in abundance. I don't deny. I just find antinatalism to be an odd response to this evil. I just find antinatalism. So there's no logic there. It's not very direct. Look, if you don't have children, then there's no suffering. It's not an issue at all. There's no deprivation of pleasant mental states. There's no suffering. Right at the core, right at the base of where every single organism that has ever lived, you know, if that base is not provided, if there's no foundation for life to come into existence, then it's getting at the base. It gets at the base of all the pain and suffering that has ever been experienced on this planet. It seems to me to be more of a giving up. Well, the non-existent people cannot give up on something. You have to bring people into existence for there to be an issue of them giving up on something. And he says, if I break my arm, I get a cast. I don't shoot myself in the head so that I don't feel the pain of a broken arm. So here is conflating the notions of starting versus continuing life. You know, if you don't have children, you're not shooting your non-existent children in the face. You're really not. You're just deciding not to have children. So how can you equate to that to actually killing somebody here? This is what I'm up against. And mankind is in a really dire situation.